to invite Vladimir Putin, who is an indicted war criminal, indicted by the International Criminal Court, to come for a state visit is just a slap in the face for justice for all the victims in Ukraine.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder on the show with us. He's spoken to us about Donald Trump's decision to not impose tariffs on Russia, but to impose tariffs on Ukraine. So all that today, plus this meeting, this NATO meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels, the takeaways from that, the commitment to Ukraine, how much spending is needed. So that plus the fact that Putin is continuing his attacks on Ukraine and when that negotiations have stalled. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Great to be here.
We've had so much aftermath, so much market reaction when it came to Liberation Day, Donald Trump's day of imposing all of these tariffs from big to small. But one of the more interesting takeaways was kind of why did he not impose any tariffs on Russia? So he was asked about this over the weekend. He basically said his decision to not impose any tariffs over Russia was to not conflate the two issues. It's not appropriate to throw a new thing into these negotiations right in the middle of it. So right in the middle of these negotiations to end the war. But he did impose 10% tariffs on Ukraine. So that country is also in the middle of the war. So I want to read out a few facts for you because people might say, well, look, Russia and the United States aren't doing as much trade as they used to. But in 2024, the US total trade with Ukraine was $2.9 billion. And basically the exports to Ukraine were 1.7 billion and the imports were 1.2. So there's a trade surplus of about nearly $500 million. For Russia, they do more trade. It's about $3.5 billion. The exports to Russia is 526 million. The imports from Russia is $3 billion. So they're actually importing more imports from Russia than they are from Ukraine. So what was your reaction when you read these comments about why Donald Trump decided not to invoke these tariffs on Russia?
Well, it's very consistent with everything else that's been going on, which is that Russia is being given, more favorable treatment than Ukraine in the same situation. As you mentioned, Ukraine was subject to tariffs, even though there is a trade surplus between the United States and Ukraine, and Russia wasn't tariffed, even though there's a trade deficit. And I'm not sure if this was like intentional or surely the excluding Russia part was intentional. I'm not sure if they even thought about Ukraine in the process. It doesn't seem as if Ukraine gets a lot of respect or deference when it comes to the White House, and this is very much par for the course. It's very annoying to watch Russia get this sort of kid glove treatment when Ukraine is getting really for what I would consider to be very harsh treatment.
Over I guess the end of last week, Bill, we saw some more attacks. We saw a deadly missile attack from Russia into Ukraine. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron, he basically responded and called for more pressure to be put on Russia. This coupled with the fact that Vladimir Zelensky continued to urge the West to ramp up pressure on Russia. Do you think that these calls might go unnoticed after Liberation Day, whether Western countries are focusing more on their economy?
Well, I think that this stock market crash, this potential recession/depression that the world is facing has consumed everybody's attention over the last couple of days. And it's very hard for anyone to pay attention to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And surely Donald Trump is only paying attention to his tariffs at the moment. So I think, it kind of reminds me a little bit of when October 7th happened, which was absolutely tragic, and it completely diverted the world's attention away from Ukraine. And it looks like this sort of tariff war, trade war that Donald Trump has started has diverted everyone's attention away from Ukraine and everything else other than this trade war at the moment.
I mean, it does feel like in society, Bill, we really can only focus on one thing at a time, one major situation at a time. Do you think that Donald Trump knew this when he was kicking off Liberation Day, knowing that perhaps the conversation wouldn't be surrounding whether or not he was in favor of Putin, whether or not he had Ukraine in his best interest right now?
Well, Trump's modus operandi, and this is not just in his second term, but in his first term, is just to throw so much stuff out there that people don't have any time to pay attention to whatever was thrown out the previous day, because there's something more crazy, more outrageous, more attention gathering than the previous day, and that's just the way he operates. And in a certain way, it's a very effective strategy, because no matter how upset you are about what happened yesterday, you'll be even more upset about what happened today. And I'm not sure if it's deliberately he's thinking, I need to get everyone's attention off of Russia, Ukraine. It's more just, I'm Donald Trump and I want everyone to pay attention to me today, and I'm going to do something to make sure they do. And he continues to do that.
This ballistic missile attack, Bill, it killed at least 20 Ukrainians, including children, and injured about 50. It actually was targeted from Russia into Zelensky's hometown. I wonder, do you think this was an orchestrated attack from Putin wanting to hit Zelensky's hometown?
It's hard to get inside Putin's criminal terrorist mind. I don't know whether it was specifically that for that purpose or just for the purpose of terrorism. This is terrorism. It's just as plain as and simple as that. It's state-sponsored terrorism, killing civilians, killing children with no military purpose, with no explanation, with no apologies. It's just terrorism, and I don't think anyone can characterize it as anything other than that. And whether it's to Zelensky's hometown, or whether it's to Kiev or Odessa or Kharkiv, every one of those lives, every one of those innocent civilian lives matters, and there has to be justice in the end, because that's what it is, just terrorism.
Last week, you and I spoke about this meeting between Kirill Dmitriev, one of Trump's envoys, and Washington. They met and they spoke about, both of them said there was great progress, but basically from us reading it, that we know that there's been absolutely no outcome. So at the time of Dmitriev's meeting, Vladimir Putin called up one of his largest conscripts for 160,000 troops to fight for Russia, as well as continued drone strikes into Ukraine. So various experts and outlets are discussing right now, is this Putin's strategy? This is Putin's strategy right now, to basically have this facade of one of his envoys visiting Washington to discuss ending the war, what Russia would need, the conditions, etc., while calling up conscripts, continuing attacks, continuing killing Ukrainians. And the discussion is whether Donald Trump is being played.
Well, Putin is definitely employing a strategy which he has always employed. And it's not just Putin, it's every other Russian when there's a conflict situation, which is to negotiate, but never agree to anything. And these aren't negotiations. These are just endless discussions. And it's kind of just dragging out the whole thing without ever agreeing to anything. And it's pretty clear to me and anyone else who's watching this conflict carefully that Putin has no intention of compromising, negotiating, or stopping the war in Ukraine. And is it making Trump look bad? Yes. Does Trump care about that? He doesn't seem to at the moment. How long can this carry on for? As long as Trump allows it to go on for. And that could be a long time if there's all these other issues and incidents which are taking up the public mind and the public space.
Donald Trump's team have started to advise him that he shouldn't be calling Vladimir Putin directly until ceasefire, until the end of the war is negotiated and that there are terms agreed upon, Bill. But at the same time, the Kremlin have also said that there are now no plans to talk between the two nations after Dmitriev's visit to Washington. So does it feel to you that there is some sort of tension between the two nations now that they've decided there is no reason to be talking right now?
Well, I don't think there's any tension. What I see is just a sort of relaxed approach towards Putin. If you remember, there was an interview, I think it was last week, in which Donald Trump was almost making excuses for Vladimir Putin. When Trump was asked why has there been no progress, Trump said, "Yeah, I think Putin may be delaying things. I've done that myself a few times. That's just how things are." And so at the moment, I don't see any tough actions. There was a few tough words. Trump said he was pissed off. He used those exact words. But what does that calculate into in terms of action? I have not seen any action. There's been no, as Trump using Trump's language, taxes, tariffs, or sanctions imposed on Putin. And in the meantime, by the way, Vladimir Zelensky has stopped attacking any seaborne Russian vessels as part of his unilateral agreement with the United States for a ceasefire in the Black Sea. And how has Putin responded to that? They started using Russian vessels to launch missiles on Ukrainian civilians, killing them. And so Ukraine has now got its hands tied behind its back in the Black Sea. If they were to break this agreement of not making any attacks in the Black Sea, Trump would certainly get mad at Zelensky. He would probably withhold military aid. And so Ukraine has basically got to allow Russia to attack them from the Black Sea because Russia's not adhering to this agreement and Ukraine is.
Would it make a difference if Trump were to start publicly condemning Putin?
Well, I think it would make more of a difference if Trump were to do something. If he were to say, okay, in this case, we're going to send in another 500 ATACMS missiles, and we're going to allow Ukraine to use those missiles for military purposes where they see fit. That would certainly get Putin's attention. Trump could also follow up with oil and say, we're going to sanction Russian oil. We're going to sanction anybody who uses Russian oil in the same way he's done with Venezuela. There's lots of things that Trump could do, but all these words are empty. What we need to see is deliberate, verifiable actions which show Putin that Trump is on Ukraine's side, not on Putin's side.
It is kind of worrying, I guess. Donald Trump, he keeps throwing this threat around of placing sanctions on any country and tariffs on any country that is importing oil from Russia. But it's kind of like, Bill, at what point will that threat become a reality? Because he's been throwing that around for a while now, and it hasn't come to fruition at all. And now they've escaped their own tariffs. But I think let's get into this NATO meeting of foreign ministers in Brussels last week. One of the takeaways I thought was interesting was basically Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He said that ending the war in Ukraine would have to be ultimately the decision made by the Russian leader. What's your reaction to that? That final decision, he said, is just up to Vladimir Putin.
He's exactly right. Who started the war? Vladimir Putin. Ukraine didn't start the war. Russia started the war. Russia launched an unprovoked war of aggression against a peaceful neighbor. And at any point, Russia could stop the war by not firing any more missiles, by not sending any more troops, by withdrawing its troops. And so Secretary of State Marco Rubio was stating the truth, which is that this war is solely happening because of Putin, and it could solely be stopped by Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin should stop this war.
He said that he believes he will know where Putin's mind is at in terms of whether a ceasefire will be brokered in a matter of weeks, not months. He said, I'll know whether Putin is serious about peace and a ceasefire in a few weeks. What's your response to that?
Well, I wouldn't rely too much on the timing of any of these statements because remember, Trump started out by saying that he was going to end the war in 24 hours. Then his special envoy for Ukraine, General Kellogg, said, I think it's going to take 6 months. And they're throwing around all sorts of different estimates. There's no way of estimating when Vladimir Putin will do something or when he won't do something. And by the way, to the extent that Vladimir Putin's expected to do something in a matter of weeks, then he'll come up with some type of minor concession, which is a non-concession, and another negotiation and another meeting, and that will drag things on. That's how the Putin regime operates. They have no intention of stopping this war, and I don't believe anything will happen in a couple weeks, and I don't believe that there'll be a definitive response in a couple weeks, because their whole approach is just to confuse and prevaricate and carry on.
I think that Trump and his team should have learnt from Donald Trump's, 48, 24-hour timeline from his campaign that perhaps they shouldn't be throwing these ridiculous numbers around. But at the same kind of NATO meeting, Dutch Foreign Minister Casper Veldkamp, he said an interesting quote. He said, at some point we may all lose patience, especially the Americans, because Russia continues to stall. That comment was in reference to the Black Sea region and the fact that Putin keeps stalling that ceasefire. He says, we believe now that it is time to increase pressure on Russia and support to Ukraine as much as possible. So that's obviously the takeaway from this meeting, that EU foreign ministers, members of NATO, along with members from the Indo-Pacific region, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, were also at a separate meeting. And the takeaway, my understanding, Bill, was that everyone came out basically saying we need to increase pressure on Russia, we need to increase aid to Ukraine, which I thought was such a positive message, especially after all these countries have been hit with tariffs this week. So how do you think they can increase this pressure on Russia? And what kind of funding do you think is needed to be giving Ukraine right now?
Well, the first and most important issue is, will the U.S. continue the level of military aid, financial and military aid, that the U.S. has been giving before? And the aid continues, but this aid that continues at the moment is aid that was previously approved by the Biden administration and has just been sort of sent in and continues to be sent in. What happens next is probably the key issue, because this aid that was approved by the Biden administration will run out. And then the question is, will Trump get in front of Congress and say, we need more military aid for Ukraine? And the fear that I have, and I think the fear that the rest of the world has, or those who support Ukraine at least, is that Trump won't do that. He'll wash his hands of this whole thing. And there's a lot of indications that may be in the cards. This unbelievable, indecent proposal they call the minerals deal, which is basically trying to force Ukraine to hand over all their economic resources into perpetuity to America in exchange for the $100 billion of military aid, not military loans, but military aid that the U.S. already gave. That deal's never going to be signed. I believe that when it's not signed, Trump will get very angry, and perhaps that will be the reason he justifies not giving future military aid to Ukraine. I think the key is ultimately going to be, will America carry on? And I think there's a lot of people in NATO and other NATO countries that are trying to put a positive spin on everything in the hopes that somehow by doing that, it will encourage America to do the right thing. But I don't think that that's in the cards. I think that it's very likely that Trump cuts off Ukraine.
If that happens, Bill, do you think that will prompt the EU to officially confiscate this $300 billion of frozen Russian assets and actually put it in the hands of Ukraine?
Well, so Europe has a very stark choice. They can either support Ukraine or they can allow Ukraine to fall if the United States pulls out. If they allow Ukraine to fall, it puts Europe in a very vulnerable position, because Putin will then make a move on other EU countries, particularly Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And of course, if that were to happen, it would be an unbelievable catastrophe for the European Union. And therefore, it's clearly in the European Union's interest not to let Ukraine fall and to do whatever is necessary for Ukraine to survive. And then the question is, where does the money come from to do whatever is necessary? and there's two sources. There's either the European taxpayers or there's Vladimir Putin. And when I say Vladimir Putin, as you mentioned, there's $300 billion of Vladimir Putin's money, almost all of which is frozen in Europe. That money could be confiscated. And I think when push comes to shove, when the pen is meeting the paper, when there's real decisions have to be made, that decision will be made because it's just too much money for the Europeans to spend out of their own pockets after increasing taxes in various countries and so on and so forth. I don't think that the public in Europe has the appetite to double down when America pulls out.
So it's time officially for Europe to make Putin pay for his own war.
Well, I believe it's been time officially since the war started, but it's time politically, I would say, politically and financially, to confiscate that money. And there's the clock is ticking, because if that money is not confiscated, every 6 months there needs to be a unanimous decision of the European Union member states to continue freezing that money. And if that decision comes up in July, there's a very real possibility that Hungary, run by Viktor Orban, Putin's friend, he will veto the sanctions, and all it takes is one country to veto them, and then the money goes back to Russia. And so instead of Ukraine having that money, Russia has that money to purchase weapons to kill Ukrainians, as opposed to Ukraine having that money to defend themselves from Russians.
Yeah, it's absolutely crunch time, Bill, and we've discussed that numerous times on this show, so hopefully it gets kicked into motion. But just a final question for you. It was revealed last week that Vladimir Putin had accepted an invitation from India's Narendra Modi to go and visit India. Now, the two are reportedly discussing a new economic roadmap for 2030. They plan to double their bilateral trade to over $100 billion annually. It currently stands around $60 billion. So what's your reaction to that friendship? Is this a dangerous friendship between the two?
Well, I think it's an immoral friendship. Russia has become a pariah state. Russia has broken all the rules of international law. And for India to be sort of turning the other cheek and saying, you know what, we just want to do business, I think it's a gross, disgusting decision by the Indians. And moreover, to invite Vladimir Putin, who is an indicted war criminal, indicted by the International Criminal Court, to come for a state visit is just a slap in the face for justice for all the victims in Ukraine.
Absolutely. We'll be waiting to see when that meeting takes place. So, Bill Browder, thank you so much for joining the Trump Report today.
Thank you.